did. So I'll have to start off from there. About 10 o'clock in the morning, we were marched to the station in St Helens, and we found that we were on our way to Warrington. And Warrington was a barrack town, and it was really the headquarters of the South Lancashire Regiment. So we thought that's where we'd all wanted to join the South Lancashire Regiment, and we thought we were going there to be admitted. But we had a medical examination when we got there, and after the medical examination had taken place, we were given a dinner, and then we were marched to Warrington Station and found out we were on our way to Wigan. Now, Wigan was the headquarters of the 5th Manchester Battalion of the Manchester Regiment. So we got there, and we were all disappointed because we hadn't been able to join the South Lancashires, but there was nothing we could do about it. And we were given uniforms, and then after we got our uniforms in Wigan, we were marched off to billets. Well, actually, we weren't billeted in any barracks or any camp or anything like that. We were billeted with private people. And of course, as this Billy Case and I had kept together, and the billet that we were going to could only take 2 youths, Billy Case and I went to the same billet, and we were there for. The day was Wednesday, and we were there till Friday. Well, what we had to do was, after we'd had a breakfast in the billet where we'd gone to, we had to report at the battalion headquarters, and we had a lot of squad drill and all that sort of thing. There was a sergeant there, and he used to drill us. Well, it was no trouble for me, of course, because being in Boys' Brigade, I'd had plenty of that sort of thing. But that's all we were doing all the time, all morning and afternoon, squad drill. And, of course, we were allowed out at 5 o'clock. We finished at 5 o'clock and went back to a billet, and we didn't have to report back till 9 o'clock the next morning, so it wasn't so bad. And we could go for a walk at night after tea. Well, on the Friday, we were told we were going to be moved to join the battalion. And the battalion at that time was in Colchester. Colchester is really a barracks town. It's a big barrack town, and there's, in fact, the 5th Manchesters were part of the 66th East Lancashire Division, and the whole of the division was down at Colchester. And when you come to consider that a division at full strength is nearly 20,000 men, it gives you some idea of the size of the barracks in Colchester, and of course the outlying grounds, because of course they'd had to build a lot of new huts, take over a lot of fresh land outside the barrack area in order to put up all these men. Now, although we weren't supposed to go home that night, most of us, because we lived near too, and it wasn't much trouble to get from Liverpool to Prescott on the train. Most of us went home to say goodbye to our people, and of course we'd had to take off our civilian clothes while we were there and while we were in uniform and parcel them up to be sent home. So we took these home while we were at it, and we had to report at 9 o'clock as usual the next morning, Saturday morning, and we were marched to the station in Wigan. Well, first of all, I'd better say that an officer had come up from Colchester to take us down, and he marched us to the station in Wigan, and we boarded a train that took us to London first, and we arrived in Euston Station, and this officer who'd been sent to conduct us to Colchester, of course, he knew all the rigmarole, and he marched us across London after we'd left the train to Liverpool Street Station. Then we had to get on another train that took us to Colchester. Well, when we arrived at Colchester, we had quite a surprise, because the battalion had a band, and this band was waiting for us outside the station. Of course, we'd picked up people from Warrington as well as people from St Helens and Prescott and all round before we'd gone to Wigan, so that there was about 200 of us by the time we got to Colchester. And of course we all fell in and marched behind this band into Colchester, right through Colchester until we came to the camp where the Manchesters were. And of course we felt quite proud of ourselves marching through Colchester behind this band. Well, when we got to camp, we found out it was quite a good camp, well set out. There's roads, proper metal roads going through it, with nice comfortable huts on either side of the road. And when we halted and we were split up, so many to each company of the battalion. Well, unfortunately, the four of us who came from the Holt and Prescott were all put in different. There was Billy Case he was in A company, put in A company. Teddy Strettle was put in A company. And there was Charlie Jones and myself were both put in D company. Well, we soon got used to the life in this camp, and it was the usual infantry training, a lot of squad drill, physical exercises, then on to learning how to throw Mills bombs and learning bayonet fighting and learning how to shoot and all that sort of thing. And we actually had quite a nice time there, because of course it was in the middle of summer too. But after we'd been there about 3 months, it was decided to move, to toughen us up a bit, so we had to move into a camp called, it was in a place called Wivenhoe Park, and Wivenhoe Park was about 2 miles or so outside Colchester, and it was a big private park that had been taken over by the army, and from being in nice, comfortable huts and all that sort of thing, we were under canvas in this place, and then after we'd been there a bit, the weather broke, and before very long we were learning what it was like to be up to the ankles in mud, because with us men marching up and down and churning the grass up, it wasn't long before it was all just a proper mud mass. And we stayed in this camp for quite a time. Now, while I was in this camp, there wasn't only our battalion in this camp. In Wivenhoe Park, there's about 6 different battalions. There's about 3 other battalions of the Manchesters and 2 battalions of the East Lancashires. So there's about 6,000 men altogether. So you can get an idea of how churned up the parade grounds and all round the tents and everywhere were. But we could still get into Colchester. We had to walk, of course, but there was a path across fields from the park, and this brought us down. If we walked across these fields, it was more like a big meadow, but if we walked across this meadow, we came to the River Colne, which ran along there, and we walked along this River Colne bank until we came to a place which was on the edge of Colchester, and that was where the trams ran from. So, if we'd had the money, we could have got a tram from there and gone into the centre of Colchester. But as our pay in the army was only £1 a day, and most of those allowed our parents. I, for instance, allowed my mother 6pence a day out of that. It meant that I was left with 3 and 6pence a week, and out of that 3 and 6pence a week, there was various what they call the various stoppages. You had to pay for what they call barrack room damages. And there was so much a week stopped out in money. I think it was about 3pence. But there were different things that were stopped out your money. The barrack room damages, by the way, was that if there was any damage done by any of the soldiers, someone coming in late at night, perhaps they'd had a drink or two and they did some damage, all that had to be put right out of this barrack room damages that was stopped out your wages. Everybody had to pay it. But so that by the time the different things had been stopped out of our money, we hadn't much left. And of course, being out in the open air all the time, we got a terrific appetite, and what bit of money we had was usually spent on perhaps buying something to eat when we got in Colchester. Because there was various places, soldiers' clubs that had been opened, where you could get a cup of tea and a rock bun or some cake like that. It had to be something that was substantial, not something light, because we wanted something to fill up. But we only charged a penny for a cup of tea and a penny for a rock bun. But and then you had to write home, of course, to your parents, so you never had any spare money. So we couldn't afford to go into Colchester on the tram. We had to walk. And it was while we were walking, well, we weren't walking into Colchester, we were actually coming out of Colchester one evening, and Billy Case and I, we passed a couple of girls, and Billy Case was quite a boy for the girls, and he made some remark as we passed them, and they turned round and evidently encouraged us, and we went back and we started talking to them, and the result was that after a week or two of meeting them occasionally like that, I was going out with one of the girls named Beatty Wilson. And in fact, I kept on going out with her till the end of that particular year. But of course, I'll tell you more about that later on. As I say, I'll tell you about while we were in Wivenhoe Park. There was one occasion when we had to march to Clacton-on-Sea, which was about 20 miles away. Now, there was going to be a big review at Clacton-on-Sea. The King was going to review the 66 East Lancashire Division, and they'd made quite a do of it. Well, we set out to march to go to this place one dinner, just after we'd had a dinner. We were fall in and we started to march there. And it was too far to march all in one afternoon, so we got about halfway and we were marched into a field, and we had to what they call bivouac there for the night. Well, that meant that, because when you went on a route march like that, you carried everything with you. You got quite a lot of equipment. You had your pack with all your spur shirts and socks and different things in, and your coat was wrapped up and put inside. You'd all your equipment, such as your trenching tool and your bayonet and your rifle and your ammunition, all those sort of things you had to carry when you were marching. And also you had to carry a blanket which was rolled up and fastened underneath your pack, and a ground sheet, and this ground sheet was waterproof. Well, the idea was that if you had to sleep out in the open, you lay on the ground sheet and it kept the damp from striking through. Well, it started to rain, so what we had to do was about 6 of us got together and we pooled all our ground sheets, and there was some kind of hurdles in this field that the farmer had put to kind of partition off one part of his field from the other. So we went and got one of these hurdles, well, 1 or 2 as a matter of fact, and we made a kind of a little tent with them. And we put all our ground sheets on top of these hurdles to stop the rain from getting through. And we all lay together side by side, which kept us warm. And actually we slept, well, I slept quite well. It didn't bother me a bit. We were nice and warm and dry, and that's all that mattered. But next morning, of course, we paraded again, and we had to start the final part of a march. Well, we had a real hard day this day, because we'd got to march from this field into Clacton-on-Sea. And when we got to Clacton-on-Sea, we were drawn up in the streets was near to the promenade, but not right on the promenade. And at a given signal, we all had to rush onto the front. The idea was that the Germans were trying to land and we were going to stop them. Well, when we got onto the promenade, we found out it was all barbed wire. Where there was no holiday makers there. All the front was barbed wire, and there was artillery along the front with sandbags all round to protect them. And when we got to the front, the artillery was blasting off, and in the distance, in the sea, we could see a lot of warships, and these warships were gradually closing in, coming in towards the prom. And when they got so far, they stopped, and one of the smaller ships came off, and King George V was on this ship, and he came to the sand and then came onto the promenade, and by the time he'd arrived on the promenade, we were all drawn up in a long double line, and he came along and inspected us. Well, and that ended that part, but the worst bit was now we got to march back. And as I say, we'd done the first part of our journey in 2.5 days. But now we had to march that all the way back from the Clacton-on-Sea to our camp in one afternoon. And I can tell you, by the time we got back to camp, my feet were sore. We had to go along to the first aid tent and have our feet painted with iodine because of the blisters. But anyway, it all made for excitement and interest, and we enjoyed it in spite of the hardships of the long march. There's another thing I could tell you about while we were at Wivenhoe Park. There was one night that I was on sentry, and my turn for sentry was about, it would be about from 1 o'clock to 3, which was usually about the worst time for being on sentry because it's at its coldest at that time of the night, from 1 o'clock in the morning till 3. But anyway, I had quite a lot of excitement this night, because while I was marching backwards and forwards on sentry go, there was suddenly a noise, it was like a railway train, like an express train thundering along, only it was up in the sky. But I couldn't see anything, and I wondered what it was. And then looking towards London, in the direction of London, I could see anti-aircraft shells bursting in the sky. And I thought, that's evidently a Zeppelin raid on London. Well, I watched these anti-aircraft shells bursting, and all at once I saw something burst into flames. And then it turned on its end just like a cigar, and it was just like a red-hot cigar as the flames all leapt up the whole length of this Zeppelin, and it plunged down to earth. Well, about a quarter of an hour after this, I heard this noise again that I'd heard before, that like the express train thundering along in the sky, and I couldn't make out what it was, although I begun to wonder if it could be a Zeppelin, and course, in the dark, I wouldn't be able to see it because it passed right over the camp. And then perhaps about 5 minutes later, in the distance, this was out in the country, there was suddenly a large blue flame lit up, and it lit up the whole of the camp, just like daylight. And of course I realised then that it must have been a Zeppelin that had passed over, but I couldn't understand what had happened to it, because this blue flame, it wasn't like a Zeppelin on fire. It was because the Zeppelin on fire was like all red, where this was blue, like an electric, like a blue light. And well, I forgot all about it, of course, after a bit. But then next morning, we learned that this big blue light that I'd seen, it was a Zeppelin that had been hit by the anti-aircraft, but it hadn't set on fire, but it was damaged, and it had to land in a field out in the country. And the Germans themselves had lit, so to try and destroy the Zeppelin before anybody got to it, they'd set fire to it, but with it being the gas inside the envelope, it was all that we saw was this gas, was the light from this gas as it all went off. So we found out also that some of the crew had been hurt when they landed, and they were prisoners in Colchester Hospital. Well, the next day, our battalion, I don't know about any of the others, but our battalion was marched to this place where the Zeppelin had fallen. We were marched there. It was about 11 miles away, we found out. And when we got there, this Zeppelin, there was just the aluminium framework left. Of course, as I say, they'd set fire to it, and the envelope itself had gone up just in this big blue flame. But all the aluminium work, it was almost perfect. And it was so long that it was lay right across one field, and it was resting on the edge and part in another field. And I remember we were all trying to get near to it to try and get some souvenir, but of course they'd put guards all round, and we weren't allowed to go too near. But what did happen was some of these guards, they'd managed to pick up lumps of aluminium while they were on the job, and they got they got somebody who was very clever at that kind of work to make rings out of this aluminium. And some, with a business idea, was selling these rings, and I remember I bought one, and I gave it to my mother. But I don't know what became of it, because I don't ever remember seeing it since. But that concluded that part of the business. Another thing worth mentioning is that while I was at Colchester, I had the toothache badly. In fact, I had one or two bad teeth, double teeth they were, that had started to decay. And I reported to the medical room, and one morning I had to go along with other men. We were marched into Colchester, to the hospital, the military hospital in Colchester, for dental treatment. Well, when we got outside the hospital, the part of the building where the dentistry part was taking place, there was a long line of about 50 men. And we had to take a place behind these 50 men to wait a turn. But the remarkable thing about it was that there was only one dentist, and he'd got 2 chairs in the room where he was extracting these teeth. And there would be a man sat on each of the chairs, and what he did was he'd go to one man and he'd freeze his gums, and then while the cocaine was taking effect, he'd go to the other man and he'd inject cocaine into his gums. And then, by the time he'd done that, the cocaine would have been working in the fellow who he'd done first. And so he'd extract that man's teeth. And then another man would take his place and he'd stick the needle in his gums and go back to the other man and draw his teeth. And he was doing that all morning. And the number of men he got through was marvellous. In civilian life, he'd have been making a fortune at that rate. But it came to my turn, and of course I was always a little bit touchy about teeth, but it didn't hurt me a bit, and I didn't feel anything. Despite the fact that he was going from one to the other and dealing with all these men, he must have been a real good man at his job. Well, of course, he was getting the experience, wasn't he? But I always remember that. The next thing of interest was when we fired our rifle course. Of course, up to this time, we'd been learning to fire a rifle, but it was all done with blank ammunition. But at a certain time in your training, you had to go to what they called the butts, where there was great big hills. They were artificial, really. There'd been soil or sand had been banked up, so that when your bullets passed through the target, they ended up in this big bank of soil or sand. Well, the time came when we all had to learn to start firing with live ammunition, and we had to go to the butts, and we had certain drill to go through. For instance, you started firing from 600 yards, and then you moved forward, kept moving forward 100 yards until you came to 200 yards, and that was the shortest distance that you fired from. And then you had rapid firing and all different things, but you were firing at a target, you see, and when your bullet hit the target, it made a hole in the target so that they could see where your bullet had hit. Now, you got marks for this. If your bullets landed in the ball, of course, that was the centre of the target. You got higher marks than if it landed in. There was what they call the bull, the inner and the outer. And of course, if you missed altogether, that was none. And you had a red flag for that. But we went to fire our course, and I did fairly well. I wasn't amongst the best, but I did very well. Apart from that, I got fairly high marks. The very best, the men with the highest marks, they were picked out to be snipers. And then the men in the next best, like myself, we were put in the machine gun section. And so, of course, because I'd done pretty well, I was put in the machine gun section and learned how to fire a machine gun, take it to pieces and also repair it and do all that sort of thing. But there was one thing about being put in the machine gun section, that you became what they call a specialist. And if you were a specialist, you got out of a lot of the ordinary fatigues that the ordinary infantryman had to do. You didn't even have to do sentry, for instance, and you didn't have to do cookhouse fatigues and all the different odd jobs that soldiers have to do. You were, as they call it, special, because you were doing something special and you had to have special training from that. So that instead of being trained along with the rest of the men in the company, you trained on your own as the machine gun section. And you were billeted all together too. You got your own officer and your own sergeant and corporal. And of course, there was more specialists besides machine gunners. There was, for instance, signallers. They were picked out to be specialists. They had to learn the Morse code and be able to signal by either tapping a key or by flag waving, for instance, same as they do in the Navy. But I found it very nice to be in the machine gun section because it was more interesting, and we went off on our own, and we didn't have to do a lot of the monotonous things that the ordinary infantryman would have to do. But after we'd fired this, it was getting towards the end of the autumn then, getting nearer to winter, and we did manage to get to, I think it was 6 days leave. The whole battalion were given leave only in 2 lots. One half went one week and the other half went the following week, and that was my first leave from the army. Well, after I came back from leave, and as I say, it was beginning to go into winter, we were moved out of this Wivenhoe Park where we'd been in tents, because it had got that much of a mess of mud and whatnot that it simply wasn't fit for anybody to be in. So we were moved into Colchester, in the town itself, and there was in the residential district, there was quite a few empty houses. There were middle-class houses, quite fairly big. And of course, we were moved into these houses, and it was quite nice because we were right in the centre of the town. And there was one thing, though, that I didn't see as much of Beatty Wilson while I was in this part, because she lived in another part of the town altogether, and where we used to pass on the way coming into town from Wivenhoe Park. But the machine gun section, we were all in one house together. And I can't remember, there wasn't a lot to mention about that, because it was just we went out for training every day, and when we came back we'd be nothing particular to do, only just sit around and clean her equipment and this sort of thing. There was only one thing I might mention, that Charlie Jones also, from the lad from Prescott, he'd done well in the shooting, so he'd been put in the machine gun section too. But to give you some idea of the discipline, though, in the army, we'd been out firing the gun on practice one evening, and when we came back, got to the house where we were billeted, the corporal in charge said to Charlie Jones, clean the gun, because the gun had to be cleaned, of course, and put in working order after we'd been using it. So Charlie said, I did it last time, Corporal. He said, never mind whether you did it last time or not, you cleaned the gun. Well, Charlie cleaned the gun. Next morning, he found out he was on a charge of hesitating to obey an order. And he got 6 days CB for hesitating to obey an order. So that shows you how, because it was supposed to be one of the worst things in the army, was to refuse to obey an order. And we all knew that was drilled into us very, very carefully. You must never refuse to obey an order. If you felt, that it wasn't fair, you could complain to your officer after, but you must do as you were told at the time. But we never heard of anybody being brought up for hesitating to obey an order. Well, it was coming up near to Christmas now, and your Uncle Alf had got leave from France. He'd been in France the second time for 15 months before he got any leave, and he'd come home on leave, on 10 days leave, and my mother had written to me and told me that he'd come home, and I omitted to tell you previously rather, that I did very well when we came to fire the course with a machine gun, not with a rifle, that I came out top in marks, so I was made #1 on the gun, and my company officer was very pleased because it was a kind of an honour for the company. So, trading on this, I went along to him and asked if I could have 3 days leave to go and see my brother, because he'd come home from France and I hadn't seen him for so long. And luckily, he gave me 3 days leave, so I was able to come home and spend 3 days at home and see your Uncle Alf. Because, of course, you never knew whether you'd see each other again. Well, one strange thing while I was over was that Auntie Mary's boy, Auntie Mary, of course, as I told you, her young man had been killed earlier on in 1915. And she now started courting a young fellow named Jim Parr. And this Jim Parr was a friend of he was in the Navy, by the way, but he was a friend of your Uncle Alf, had been in school days. So, and he happened to be on leave as well from the Navy, but he'd begun courting your Auntie Mary too. And so we went along I, along with your Uncle Alf, went to Liverpool where Jim Parr's family had moved, and to see this Jim Parr. And when after we'd had tea at his mother's, your Uncle Alf liked to drink, and so did Jim Parr. So we went out, the three of us went out to a pub. Well, they sat there drinking for about a couple of hours, drinking and talking, but I didn't drink. I didn't smoke. And every time they ordered a pint, I had a cup of Bovril. It was rather laughable. I kept drinking these cups of Bovril while they were drinking the pints of beer. Well, I went back to the battalion in Colchester, and it was it was almost Christmas now, and there was a letter waiting for me from B.T. Wilson, and telling me not to come and see her for the next fortnight. And I couldn't make out this when but I took her at her word, and I didn't go to see her for about a fortnight. So, and when later on, I saw one of her friends, and I happened to mention this fact that she'd sent me this letter telling me not to see her for a fortnight, and I couldn't make out why. And this friend told me that she also had a boy in the Navy, and he'd been over on leave while I'd been over at the old. He'd also come home on Christmas leave, and he got a fortnight. And she didn't want me to come and see her, well, of course, while he was home. So, well, of course, I was quite annoyed at that. And later on, I got another letter telling me that, she'd like to see me again at such and such a time. So, of course, I didn't even answer a letter. I just left it at that. I never spoke to her or got in touch with her at all after. I was so much annoyed. And it hurt me because I was very fond of her. She was a nice girl. But there was a sequel to that, and this happened while I was in France, that she wrote to... I'd given her my home address when we were courting, and so she knew where my mother lived, and she'd written to my mother asking her for my address in France. Well, your Grandma Finney, she wondered, of course, perhaps thought I'd been doing something that I ought not to have been doing, and got into trouble. Of course, there was nothing like that. It was pure platonic, it was pure love with us. And so she wrote to me first to asking permission to send my address to this B.T. Wilson. And I said, yes, you can give her an address. I've nothing to be ashamed of. So later on, I got a letter from her, and she started to write occasionally again. But of course, I never got in touch with her properly after that. I used just to write her. Sometimes she'd send me something out, but that was, as far as I was concerned, it was the end of it. But what might have happened if I hadn't met your mum when I came home, I don't know. I might even have gone to see if she was still free. But, of course, meeting your mum put an end to all that. Previous to this, the company sergeant major had been round, and, he'd had us on parade, actually, and he wanted